Okay, let's get going. I don't think I need to tell you guys that this is one of the most taboo subjects in spirituality. I would even go as far as to say society itself. And whenever there is a taboo subject, I think the word taboo to me is it rouses a lot of suspicion, a lot of fears. It's generally not spoken about in the shadow, in the light of consciousness. In other words, it tends to hide a little bit more in the shadows. And I think that it's such an important subject that I think if we start to speak into a little bit more, we will empower the subject regardless of what conclusions, we really bring. I ask you, as always, to suspend, if possible, your judgments regarding what is going to be discussed. I want you to invite you to consider that you have your mind, the majority of us, when it comes to deep-seated fears, we, to a degree, have our minds made up about that thing. And we, in general, tend to look for things that will validate that which we secretly hold near in our shadow fear. And you see that quite often. It's just a case of like we tend to have a certain idea and then we will look for reinforcements regarding that idea. And I simply invite you to put down everything you think you know about the subject. And the number one reason for that is because it is a discussion about, essentially to a degree, the unseen. And when it comes to the unseen, there are so many mountains of interpretation. And of course, at the end of this, you can simply pick up whatever you originally had, if it still stands there, or with a little bit of luck, you'll find yourself in a deeper sense of inquiry. Now, the reason why I want to speak into the subject is quite interesting, because I personally don't think that anybody can be an expert on many subjects, especially this one per se. And in the last 3 or 4 months, I have, well, I would say 10 years, but let's just say really intensely the last 3 months, I have taken a seriously deep dive into trying to find supposed experts on this subject. And what I have found, unfortunately, was not impressive for me. I tended to find people that were so lost in a specific side of the story that it was almost like a salesman. They were absolutely engaged in pushing that particular perspective regardless. And the most sad thing about my deep dive and my exploration into people that are supposedly experts in this field is simply that they are so busy arguing about what is actually happening that they've completely lost their power or their ability to actually help the person involved. And I'm hoping over this period of 75 or 80 minutes, even though I could never cover everything that needs to be said on the subject, like with the empath conversation, I'm simply going to flit across it and create, hopefully, I guess, what you could call an overview, a little bit of a map in your mind of the inception and the birth of this problem, and then the very confusing part in the middle that no one will agree on, and then essentially what it is we actually do about it and how it's solved. And I'm hoping in creating this little map, it will first of all plug us into a seat of power, immediately understanding that there is far more knowledge around this than we actually think that there is. And then my intention would be, after this talk, would be then, just like the empath conversation, I will go and take 2, 3, 4 videos, whatever it takes, and speak power into each section. But instead of covering every detail, I just want to create a little bit of an overview. So why me? Why should I speak about this? I mean, isn't that a very strange thing? Especially noticing, as I said, that no one seems to actually know what's going on here. It's a fascinating thing. The psychology stuff that I've been reading for many, many years takes a very, very hard and clear stance on this. And the religious stuff takes a very, very hard stance on this. And what's absolutely incredible is if you were to do something like, because I have lost months of my life reading them, if you were to Google something like the link between psychosis and spirituality, you will notice that thousands of psychologists last year, the highest that's ever been, wrote their thesis on how close the link is between these spiritual experiences and actual psychotic breaks. So that relationship has long existed, and it has long fascinated people. And yeah, so why me? Well, first of all, because I suppose the really simple but vulnerable answer would be that I've been battling with my own forms of mental illness since I was a little child. And I think that's given me an almost uncomfortable view in just how fast things can actually slip out of control, in an essence. The other reason would be that basically, once I managed to reestablish my life to a degree, the type of work I'm in has bought me for about 10 years in the presence of some of the most extreme cases you could possibly imagine. See, unfortunately, what everybody knows about the subject is something they've heard from somebody else, somebody spiritual or somebody that they really rely on. And the absolute gift, but also the curse of essentially working with what you could call a shamanic container, or being a shamanic facilitator, is what tends to happen, or has tended to happen in the last 10 years of my life, is that I essentially get called when people are absolutely desperate and they don't know what else to do. There's two types of people. It's generally the great explorer and the person who, I mean, it's almost like a joke that my brother would make. It's like he got so desperate he went to try and find a shaman, or whatever you want to call the facilitators. And in doing that, actually some people in this room have actually supported me in some of these experiences. I often have had experiences over the decade of being called into people's homes, very often people I had never met, people I had never had associations with, to experience what some people would call psychotic breaks, some people would call possession, and it all just depends on who you were speaking to. But whatever it is that happens, I can assure you that it tends to rock the very foundations of people to the point where they're not really sure what to do. And then the other reason why I want to speak into this is, besides what I've just shared, having a lot of personal experiences with people crawling around, speaking in voices, prophesizing many things, claiming many extraordinary things, been around many people like that. On top of that, my own personal fascination with madness, and I say that playfully, I really mean it playfully, has given me such an innate fascination into psychology and into demonism itself that, for instance, I have spent, just a silly example, thousands of hours of watching tapes which are actually available on the internet, on psychology websites, but thousands of hours, for instance, of schizophrenics and different types of people being interviewed and kind of just climbing into that psychology of what really is actually going on there. So almost in trying to solve my own psychotic breaks and my own psychosis. And I think the last reason why I'm speaking into the subject is because essentially over my decades as a spiritual person, I have gone through stages where I am convinced there is a specific psychiatric thing wrong with me. And I've even swung to the points where I was willing to believe that I was being interfered with by otherworldly things. So if anything, I think it gives me a little bit of a unique insight into this, because I feel like I've a foot a little bit in each of the possibilities. And I think the only thing that really matters is whether we can come from this conversation with a point of power of, okay, and now what? All I do know is, in my experience of what has happened and what I'm sharing with you, is that today, working with something like essentially the type of work we do, it's not the correct word, but it's about as close as you can get to an exorcism work as possible. I mean, essentially, I'm constantly involved in people that are at war at something with themselves that they're trying to remove. Some of them experience it as an actual thing, and some of them experience it as a belief system, whatever it be. But my work gives me the gift to be able to sit right on the forefront of that. And what I can tell you is the conclusions that I have managed to draw in life have led me to a point where, regardless of the growls, the screams, and the words that have been prophesied in these experiences. I put my hands on these individuals and sit with loving, caring, gentle relaxation without any fear for myself. And this has never proven itself to be in any other way. But the way I drew that conclusion was very simply through a very difficult road itself. So to paint a very simple picture for you, I am going to suggest tonight that regardless whether you're the psychologist in the room and you are here to kind of get an idea of maybe a validation for that, or try and glimpse whether there is a possibility that the other side is involved, or whether you are convinced that it is a spiritual or a physical thing, I want to almost unite us in this conversation in the realization of two things. The first thing is I want to draw how similar, almost identical, the road to this purgation almost is. And what I mean is the circumstances that lead up to this apparent event, which is then a series of events, are very, very predictable and very, you can track it. You can essentially put thousands and thousands of cases together, which I've been doing for 10 years and experiencing it on my own and on a weekly basis being involved in the facilitation of people's own exorcisms, whether it's even a thought, right? I'm not saying either side. And what's incredible is it is very predictable and very mappable. So that's the first thing I'm going to draw for us. And then on the exit of this conversation, I'm going to point out that whether you're still lost in the world of psychology or you're lost in the world of demonology, that the solutions are identical. And surely in understanding that the approach needs to be identical, we will stop arguing about the very vague invisible middle, and we will actually, as facilitators, be able to support each other far more powerfully. And if I've done my job in an hour or so time, well, then we would have come to kind of to that point. I mean, we are so busy arguing about what happens in the unseen portions of whatever it happens that we have completely lost our point of power. That's the best way I can explain it. So I think the beginning part is to actually connect into how little we actually know. And guys, do your own work. Go and research, buy books, read, speak to people. This is one of the most fractured subjects on the planet. To try and get a straight answer from people, it's absolutely ridiculous. So I want to plug in a little bit about the few years that I've been studying demonology. And now, believe it or not, demonology is actually a subject that can be studied in universities, believe it or not. And it is perhaps something that might call one of you. I, of course, am not doing it on an official thing. But if I could do a quick little run over demonology itself and what it is that I've learned in these years, is there's a few things. I mean, in this category, you would put demonism, you would put witchcraft, you would put diabolism. Trying to think if there's anything else. Black magic itself, there's just a few words that kind of people who have that idea, and it's come through history very strongly. And in demonism, you tend to study the history and the evolution of all these things, which is absolutely fascinating, you know. But what's really interesting, instead of giving you an absolute breakdown, there's a few things that are going to fascinate you if you study demonology. One of them is, for thousands and thousands of years, as far as since we've been writing about spirituality, there is this idea of the fact that there are many forces, seen and unseen. And you do see the presence right across Asia and right across many cultures like the great Greek Empire, etc., where they spoke about supposedly, I guess, what you could call today entities. But what's fascinating about this demon idea in itself is that these cultures never gave demons all that much power. Now, that's a very bold statement, but I mean this over, and I've also had this enforced by many demonology professors that I've listened to speak. And essentially what I mean by that is, an example is, if you look in the Chinese culture, there are many mischievous demons, but they were easily solved and sorted with mere offerings or a simple prayer. and you see this right through history, is that demons were present, but they were not given too much credence by the people. Even in Greek mythology, for instance, a person who had epilepsy was said to be inhabited by a god. And at the same time, they had many stories of good and bad gods. But once again, what you notice is almost a strange, the best way I can explain it is that they were only given a light bit of respect. And you discover in Greek culture that simple offerings and burning of certain things, and things such as always returning to one's base virtues, such as prayer or the reconnection to the goodness of life, would simply solve your problem. And we see this right through, I haven't done all the cultures, but Japanese, Chinese, and the Greek and Roman empires, very, very similar. Yes, there's demons. Don't take them too seriously. You can get it pretty much solved. And an absolute example of this, right, is, well, you know, what's fascinating about that is gods essentially have been blamed for far more things than they get blamed for nowadays. But regardless of what your crops did, regardless, there was always a god blamed for the breakthroughs or the breakdowns. And that's just a fascinating thing to look at in culture. And what's fascinating is even the word demon itself started off as the word daemon. And an example would be the great Socrates spoke very often, and it's not even a conspiracy. If you just go read even in his own words, he spoke of this daemon, which was an unseen force or being that helped him with a lot of his ideas. And it's fascinating how that word daemon has basically evolved to become this demon. So we're not doing a massive history lesson here, but what's very interesting about this whole thing is that what you discover amongst the people is they were more focused on the celebration of life, and that sometimes the spirits, which were very seldom in culture actually called evil, they were more referred to in demonism as mischievous. And that's a very interesting thing to notice in most areas of demonism. They were mischievous. You see that in the Celtic tradition, you see that in the Japanese tradition, and it doesn't mean that that mischievousness couldn't almost touch on a level of nefariousness, but at the basis, there was not really that sheer unconscious gripping terror that existed in any of these cultures towards these apparent creatures of negation. What becomes very interesting is that you discover that it's only at a certain time, at around, from what most scholars can tell, the 1500s, that this idea of darkness or demonism emerges to the degree where it begins to almost grip people to the degree where they're not able to keep their faculties or their wits about them. And that would be, as I said, from about the 1500s, the Middle Ages. What's also fascinating in demonology is you discover that very, very often, almost every single time where there is a rise in apparent demonic activity is always around the same amount of time when mental health and physical health is on the serious decline. From the hanging of witches to, so there's so many areas, but you can always tell that there's some form of pressure that already exists in the unhappiness, in the nutrition, in the physical structure of human beings. I think a playful way would to put it that demon outbreaks felt very seldom or never happened in happy, rich homes and palaces where everyone, it was generally in climates where these things could breed, which is a fascinating story. It's just really, and even Buddhism, I had never done Buddhism in demonology, so I went on a deep dive this week. And what's fascinating is most of what we know about how the Buddhists dealt with demonism is essentially they saw them as mischievous and selfish creatures that could be sorted out with a prayer. That was their attitude, and there are very, very few stories of them giving it too much power. It is only, it seems, when certain religions came in that they began to wield this idea almost like a weapon. And this is a very important part of the story. If you're wondering what on earth does this have to do with this thing I'm scared of or my spiritual work, you need to understand how this became so engrossed within our psyche. So understanding that for thousands of years, we've slowly built this narrative, which only seemed to have got out of hand in the last few hundred years. It's absolutely fascinating things. But for the most part, entities were not considered in nearly all cultures to be particularly tenacious. That's a fascinating thing. Absolutely fascinating, I think. And most societies were convinced that as long as you returned to that equilibrium of the goodness or the integrity or the virtues or the absolute goodness that is the true emanation of reality, that creative energy that runs through all things, that immediately one would be reset in a way that you would no longer be interacting with that thing. And that kind of was prevalent in their beliefs. Just trying to think. Yeah, there's another very, very interesting thing that I actually want to mention before we move off demonology, is there are very, very powerful correlations, because now the argument here is we're talking psychology and mentality versus some unseen force taking over you. And what's fascinating is the first congruency that we find between these two possibilities is something that always seems to be present, and that is the presence of guilt, the presence of shame, the presence of many traumatic things, which we'll speak into a little bit just now. But it's a fascinating thing that whether you want to believe that it's the psychology or what already seems to be appearing in the person's psyche is a form of overwhelming, and shame is the most common word used in a lot of these actual studies, which I think is fascinating. But basically, there's a little bit of a havoc on the psyche, and that's really important, which can actually lead the person to get to the point where they go into some form of psychosis. The real argument would be whether that psychosis is some being ripping you around, or whether that psychosis is actually some form of inner psychic pressure that is releasing in some way. And that's, as I said, is part of the journey for yourself. But I do find that very interesting that in all cases, there's a certain series of events that take place that cause these things. Yeah, it's basically like saying that there are certain correlating events always. So what's important to understand at this stage is that this fear now, I mean, what we know in epigenetics, right, is that what happened to our mothers, our grandmothers, many generations, it sits in our cells. And we're aware of this, and we're also aware of the possibility that if reincarnation and stuff like that is true, because it's never my job to speak truth into something, only powerful possibilities, then what we realize is that there's a big possibility that this idea is one of the things that have frightened us right to our core more than anything else. In religious surveys, it has been written down to be more terrifying than death for the average person. This idea of some unseen force and the power that it could have over you, which is a really, really big subject to open. So before you can move, you know, if we're going to start to personalize this a little bit, before you can really move powerfully through the subject, what presents you in this conversation, in the anxiety and in the possibilities, is essentially even to entertain an idea of walking along one day and opening a bathroom door at the wrong place and the wrong time, and something just jumps on you and takes away all your power. That's kind of the deep, dark fear that exists within us. And to even be able to have that conversation, one realizes then you are entertaining immediately a chaotic universe. And what's fascinating this is the idea of how you perceive chaos is extremely important in any spiritual work, because it's very interesting how powerfully we will say things like, oh, I meet all the right people at the right time, or we use words like synchronicity, or we are amazed how we look back on the struggles of our lives how perfect it was. Wow, that heartbreak and that pain made me so strong. And it's like we can be absolutely so aligned with how aligned the universe is. And then we almost archaically are willing to believe that I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and now my soul is in trouble. My higher self wasn't looking. It accidentally dropped the ball. I wish I had known, and now I'm going to fight for my life. And that is kind of the subconscious archetype that we're dealing with here. And I'm being very exaggerated because I have a firm belief that if you can stop worrying about what's true and you can look into the archetype of anything, what's the full version of this boogeyman, a lot of truth lies in that, in the archetype of the actual thing. So the subject of whether you believe in a chaotic universe or not is a really, really big one, because you discover, you know, there's a very famous saying, and I don't know who was it, possibly Paul the Venetian, that the perfection of the universe does not have to explain itself to you, that there is an absolute perfection to how this is working, but it holds no responsibility to explain to your logic how this actually works. And it's a fascinating subject because you discover in modern prayer that we pray very much for what it is we want in our own wants and desires. Whereas these saints of antiquity and these secret sects of society, from the schools of light in Alexandria all the way up to the schools of Gnosis, they all agreed on one thing, is their prayer was pretty much the relinquishing of the desire for things to change and almost asking for the wisdoms to see the perfection of how things truly were unfolding, which is a fascinating thing. So why would this be an important conversation? Well, if you believe the universe is completely chaotic, then you have to remain in a very high state of arousal. You have to stay defensive. You have to stay protective. And it has been my experience in my work that those that focus on protection are always in the deepest trouble. And those that don't even consider that they would be in danger at all come across no problems whatsoever. It's a fascinating thing. And it's something we're not going to lose subject or time on now. But if you consider that we are engaging with reality vibrationally and through creating our reality and through attraction, people that are fully immersed in this idea that they need to defend and protect themselves constantly are interacting with a level of reality that many of us never even bump into. It is the ultimate paradox of magic. Know that you are completely safe. And the only reason that you'd be immersed in trying to protect yourself is if you're not convinced of the absolute perfection and flow and goodness of the universe. So if you want to empower yourself in the subject, you've got to start right at the beginning. Why am I winning? Why am I willing to believe in the perfection of all things until it involves my deepest secret fear? Because it cannot be one or the other. The universe cannot be absolutely perfectly aligning your life up for you, but accidentally dropping the ball and losing every 10 people. Oops, oh, I wasn't watching. Now that guy's got something that's taken him over. So it's a very big subject and something for you to mull over for yourself. But there's an incredible thing to just consider, and that is that the universe at its core, now this, of course, I don't know for a fact, but if, for instance, you look at the Hermetic disciplines and information that has affected humanity deeply for thousands of years, alchemy, chemistry, medicine, was all born of the Hermetic wisdoms and books, and something that they spoke of very often, that I experience in my life as well, that is at its core, the universe or the world or whatever it is that the essence is inside you is integrous, is virtuous, is loving, is kind. It has these qualities that if you just imbue or embody those qualities, that all these negations will never be an issue. And that really in Hermetics, large portions of the problem start when, which I think is something that's rampant nowadays in society, and I think something I've been very guilty of, is where you hold a certain set of beliefs or perceptions, but you behave in another way, almost creating a vacuum, as though I've noticed that almost the scourge of modern spirituality is this idea that you can dance in unseen worlds without discipline, that you can reach incredible heights of something without being a disciplined individual. And I certainly have no beliefs around it, but I can tell you that if you look back at the secret mystery schools, there was a reason before you began to play in these unknown realms why you focused on absolute integrity of character. So it's a fascinating subject to think about. But essentially, if I can give you an overview of what's very sad about the whole demonology conversation, is that our fears in the history of demonology have, if anything, grown, but our faith in the simple remedies that we used to have to overcome or overthrow it has died. So it's almost like the fear has got bigger and the solutions have got smaller. And that is why madness, or whatever you want to call what we blame entities, whether they're true or not, this is not a conversation of proving or unproving something. I feel it doesn't matter which side of the fence you're on. And what we discover that in some ways it's rampant. And one of the reasons is for that. I mean, many great philosophers have spoken about the fact that all that is needed is a faith in the goodness of reality. And we are living in such a nihilistic society where we are so afraid whether there is even love or goodness flowing through the fabric of all things, that it's very easy to get washed up in these very, very big stories. But what is no doubt is that the fear, just as thousands of years ago, no matter how many mistakes we've made, the fear is very prevalent. And how do we know we've made mistakes? We know for sure because there are hundreds of things that we used to deal with through exorcisms that are today dealt with medically. That's an absolute fact. It's certainly not saying that all of this is medical. I wouldn't dare. But I am telling you that many, many cases, if you think about it, because when it comes to something like this, the only thing that we actually have is the ability to observe what is actually unfolding. And what we're observing, what's unfolding, meets our belief systems, essentially. One thing that is not too hard to believe, but moves slightly into the possibilities of the ethereal, is that Earth itself is called a body. It's interesting that we call it a body. And we know that Earth itself has an atmosphere around it, right? Which is its auric sheath. And if you look how the atmosphere of Earth, so I'm like, there's so many other ways I could have explained this to you, but I want to stay out of belief. This is just me observing what's in front of me. The as above, as below, that has been said in thousands of spiritual writings from all over the world. And what you see in one thing, you can see in all things. It's called the law of correspondence. So my observation is simple. Look at the Earth. And you notice that it has this incredible sheath around it. Call it its aura. And what you notice is there are very powerful forces that are unseen, that come from all over the universe, being X-rays, being violet, being all these type of things, solar winds, and the Earth essentially protects itself against those things effortlessly. But what we do notice in Earth itself is that most of the impurities or the destructions that take place with the auric sheath of Earth come from negations within the planet itself. In other words, the auric sheath is weakened by processes taking place inside it. And if we could imagine that this was some form of representation of just what a coincidence, you called a body, Earth's called a body. And I look at Earth, if I hold up my hands, I have rivers and veins running through me exactly like Earth. I have these tributaries, I have lungs just like the Amazon, these two huge pieces of lungs. I am mostly water, just like the Earth. And I have polarity. I have a strong negative and I have a strong positive polarity. And most of my experience of reality and interpretations and personalities and beliefs lie within how these polarities charge one another, and the result is the middle of how I experience reality. There's no spirituality in that. That's a fact of earth, and it's a fact of a human being. We know we are magnetic beings. We can take photos of the energy fields around us. It's an absolute fact. And we know, for instance, that you can almost light a small bulb just with what's going on inside your hands. So why this would be an important conversation is just like when we dirty the rivers, and just like when we put endless amounts of smog into the Earth's atmosphere, our auric sheets can certainly be weakened. And the real conversation is, once we have weakened those auric sheets, then sure, I'm sure that we do become a little bit more susceptible to our environments. So moving into the second half, there's something I find so fascinating is the word obsession is fascinating. I want to look at the etymology of the word, right? Obsession was the word for 1,000 years. Obsession was the word for being housed or having something in control of you. So it used to actually be the word for possession was obsession. And it's fascinating because people that study the subject don't know at what point, but somehow in the last 200 years, the word obsession has gone from meaning that there's a demon inside you, to being you are so consumed by an idea or a perspective. And it's almost as though we as a community or as a race have sensed that there's far more going on there than this idea of being victimized by some external force in some random universe. And I find it fascinating that that's the case, that now we use the word obsession completely differently to how we used it 200 years ago. The other thing that we really have to consider when we begin to try and draw our conclusions about the subject is we have to think about hysteria itself. Now, we don't use the word hysteria that much anymore, but we do get a general idea for what it means. I want you to consider that what we do know in modern medicine is that one can actually even become hysterically blind. If you just consider that for a second, you can become hysterically deaf. You can become hysterically immobilized. In other words, through some emotional process or fright or some belief or some event or some trauma, you can even lose your eyesight. Or you can lose your ability to use your body. So this is not at all to speak away power from the unseen forces. I just want us to consider for a second that we are aware of just how powerful our experiences are upon the body. It's an absolutely fascinating thing to consider. And as I said, how many times we have misdiagnosed things, you know. I certainly don't think that we think that there are gods inside people that have epilepsy anymore. If it is true, I wish the God within me would tell me what the lotto numbers was. It would be very, very helpful. So where this leaves us is whether it's some external being or whether it is something that's going on. It's fascinating how the word gives us a glimpse into this whole being obsessed by something. Now, what's fascinating as we go along here, if we look, I mean, I told you guys regarding whether it's in or out, this is the bottom line of what we're actually dealing with as people for ourselves or as healers. I'm going to use an analogy for you. I've been trying to think of an analogy for weeks, and this is the best one I've been able to come up with, right? I want you to consider that you yourself are a sovereign country. And as you, as a sovereign country, you also have a government. And within this government, you have many leaders within this government. You have many personality traits. You have anger, you have jealousy, you have love. You also have many proclivities and ways that your light reflects and expresses. But most important, you essentially have a head of the government. And that leader of the government is what we call in this kind of work, the controlling consciousness. And I want you to consider that essentially what is going on, because we get so lost in the woo-hoo stuff that we actually forget the simplicity of what happens, is that either a part of your personality overrides and takes over in the form of obsession or in the form of trauma fracturing or something like that, or let's say another creature or being, which exists to some people, comes in. The most important thing to get present with is essentially what's happened is the government gets overthrown. That's the most important thing. Your government, your center of. So essentially right now, if I feel in good health, it would like, yeah, exactly, I agree. It's like a control room, exactly. And I feel right now like I am the head of my government. And essentially this conversation is about the fact that there is very clearly sometimes this potential for this coup d'etat, or whatever we call it, that takes place, and the government gets overthrown. What is very powerful to note, though, whether you come from psychology side or you come from spirituality side, that neither believes in the random event. So if you are the type of person that is afraid of places you go and things you touch, and neither side, even though they disagree on many things, agrees on that, what's fascinating to discuss and to realize is that they all agree on a certain series of events that wear down that person's, and that's just a concept, you don't need to believe it, that person's auric egg or that person's control room or their ability as a government to govern this enormous, beautiful organism that you are. What a fascinating idea. And an idea of how this controlling consciousness works is you need to realize, for instance, if somebody were to become so angry that the anger would begin to consume them, a person with a healthy controlling consciousness would be able to reset the person back to the center, calling in everything that's required to make sure that the government is not overthrown. Can I give you another example? Alcoholism. A person that is prone to alcoholism, if they have a very strong controlling consciousness, they would realize when there is a massive problem, and they would, through sheer will of the government, actually do what is required to make sure that they keep the controlling consciousness. And very much what happens with many addiction spirals, etc., when they become out of control, is simply that the controlling consciousness begins to lose its ability to establish its dominance. The real question is, of course, why? So, regarding the subject of what it is that actually happens, if we look back into antiquity and the stories of old, there are very few examples of where a being overtakes a human being in story where it is beneficial. So it's a fascinating subject because there are very rare splashes where you hear of a being that integrated kind of with the human being. And for the most part, it can be said that it is considered to generally not be good for the human being's health and have some form of degradation. Or in simplicity, it is usually detrimental to your health. A very important part of this conversation, which naturally I do not have enough time to dive into deeply now, is if you are ascribing, which does not mean that I believe it or that I don't believe it, but if you are sure that the way you're interfacing with reality is that you are experiencing some being, there is, according to myself, and I must say, one of the great teachers that I've had, there is a very, very powerful area of, let's call this delusion that exists in this area. So to get present to that, I have met many of them. I have spoken to many of them, even in the last few years. People that have this idea that there is some other consciousness that they're interacting with them, and they are absolutely convinced, and the only person that can kind of tell that it is not what they think that it is everybody but them. It's an absolutely fascinating. So I want to actually stick my finger into this wound, because I've actually lost friends to this, where they literally go on this path of many, many years as the spiritual ego inflates whether they're engaging with another form of consciousness, or whether they've just discovered a deep part of their ancient wisdom of their own soul, and they're too embarrassed to own it, so they start calling it by a different name. Regardless, there is an absolute sobering way to look at this, that 90% of people that experience other beings refuse to discuss this conversation. And it's this simple. I'm trying to think of how to put it. I don't really use the Bible much, but if you think of Matthew 7:16, it says, by their fruits, so shall they be known. That's the simplicity of it. That's on the subject. What do I mean by that? A lot of people are lost in really big spiritual conversations, whether they are a channel, or whether they're some divine chosen person, or there are some empath that's just saving the whole world. And here is the sobering reality. If there is any form of enlightenment unfolding inside of a person, that person would become deeper in virtue, more integrated in value, more powerful in love, more able to interact with society, less triggered. Do you get what I'm saying? Like, we have this romantic version of spirituality that is ballooning so fast that if we don't check ourselves, we are literally going to wreck ourselves as a society. Because I would go as far as to say that although on the whole, I do believe there is awakening taking place, I would say most people are lost in what I call a false awakening. And that is a very, very touchy subject. And I'm going to touch on it slightly as we go. So what I mean by this, can we just sober ourselves up here for a second? If the thing you're interacting with in any way is detrimental to your health, it is not what you think it is. It's that simple. Because how many people do you know, and maybe you're one of those people, because I certainly have been, that believe that they're on this very romanticized, there's a good word here, martyr, a spiritual martyr, that you're so spiritual that life is hard for you, that you're so spiritual that reality doesn't really make sense. And it's this absolute ungrounded spirituality that we are passing to each other. There's even jokes constantly on the internet that to be awake means to be unstable. Bullshit. Absolute bullshit. I absolutely call bullshit. What I do know is that a lot of people that have awoken, which I want to point out in Buddhism, that awakening is only the first step of, like, you would not believe how many steps. It is literally just the first step where you go, oh, there is more going on here than we thought. We have an entire planet stuck in stage 1 of awakening, running around like a bunch of arseholes, judging each other, arguing about the color of auras, so prickly to one another, so difficult to get on with, absolutely not lost in virtues, literally just difficult individuals honing the mantle of being enlightened. Like, it's a form of delusion. And that is why speaking into the archetype, so maybe they're not possessed, but we certainly do become possessed by an idea. So I want us to just think about that. If you hold some spiritual value, or for instance, if you're a tarot card reader, or for instance, you do channeling, or for instance, I could go on forever, and you literally hold the belief that to do that thing, you get to be a more difficult person because it's such hard work, you are not tapping into the divine essence and grace of what is. There is only one thing that the divine essence is: clarity, understanding, upliftment. There is nothing unconscious about it. When the divine essence touches you, you do not wonder what happened. It's sobering, but it's something we really need to consider. So the simplicity of it is that we need to identify the archetype that says, I'm so spiritual that reality is not even really there anymore. I'm so spiritual, I've got to be careful where I go. I'm so spiritual that, like, wow, you won't believe what I deal with. Like, I fought those things off, and I mean, what world are we living in? How did the ancient schools release the information and allow us to become these airy people? I mean, the greatest philosopher who ever lived, in my opinion, is Manly P. Hall. And his exact words were, if it does not focus on the integrity and actions of your life, it is not spirituality. How many people do you know that are completely, I have been one, I am one, that are so lost in a spiritual story that there is absolutely no responsibility for how contrary their behaviors are? No integrity with money, no integrity with agreement, no integrity with personal contract, no integrity with how they treat people, no integrity for the responsibility that they take in their neighborhoods. They're so busy trying to be ascended that they don't realize that they literally, we become arseholes. It's a form of self-obsession, and we're building this absolutely ridiculous castle in the sky. It's something that's really hard to look at. You know, I wrote here, if it does not make you a better integrated, loving part of society, then honestly, you are lost in a delusion. Very harsh words, and I did tell you at the beginning, you never ever have to agree with me. But I am fascinated by how many enlightened arseholes I know. Absolutely fascinating. That I'm scared to keep an agreement with, that I'm scared to lend money to, that I wonder what they say. And like, guys, what world are we living in? And that's why why am I bringing this up in the middle of this conversation? It's the exact same thing. So what would the other side of this be? It would be that the result of too many people trying to unfold into the unseen without dealing with the absolute immutable things of life. It's kind of like saying, why are you flying a 4.5 meter kite in the sky when you only weigh 5 kilograms? It makes no sense. We are ungrounded. We are not feeling safe. Why would someone who feels unsafe, is constantly in a state of anxiety, is very unsure of what the universe is really about? Why would that person then go and open up Pandora's boxes into things where they don't have the strength to look in there? Because if they found something, they would immediately jump into the negations and the worst possible possibilities. There is a reason why these mystery schools existed for thousands of years, and they went through a process of absolute disciplines, prayer, and basically getting into the integral life before they began to open these boxes. It used to be a lifetime study. And I don't know where we got this rush for apparent enlightenment. It's actually quite scary. You know, if you look in even in Buddhism, if you look, do you know that there is in none of Buddhism, it's even suggested that you don't try and create special powers or none of it. In Buddhism, you know what happens? If you had it kind of grow because you are so enlightened for so many lifetimes, it just automatically kicks in. And when it does, they're there to help you support it. There's no idea of trying to force these areas when you can't even get by in life. The idea of trying to evolve spiritually in some unseen ethereal world when your life is a complete shambles is absolute insanity. And it's sobering. It's sobering for me, and I know that it's sobering for a lot of people to consider it that way. And there's a very, very fascinating part of this conversation, because we're talking about the realms that the mind explores in spirituality. You can pretty much come across any book and you can entertain any idea. And of course, the true nature of the universe is so incredibly expansive that anything's possible. You know, if we look at the great masters of hermetics who explained that if you look at the way the brain and the synapses in the brain work, that we are a micro representation of the galaxies of the world, and that we can, in closing our eyes, literally connect to any part of the universe. Makes perfect sense to me. Don't have to believe it. But here's the interesting thing. If you look at Paracelsus, which I spoke about in one of my talks, he is a guy that, one of the most profound men. Do yourself a favor, go learn about him. He accidentally started chemistry. He was searching for God inside molecules and then come across, and I think one of the first big things he discovered was sulfur. A lot of people say it was like the birth of well, it is the birth of chemistry. But what's fascinating is he had many, many students that apparently were led to enlightenment through him. And this was the basis of their doctrine. It was that imagination is not something that is not real. Imagination is the God tool within you that can reach to any version, frequency, radio station, dimension, or part of the universe. It can fetch anything. And what they would do is, if anybody wanted to start to explore the unseen worlds, they would first focus on absolutely grounding that person in a set of morals and a set of values that were unshakable. In other words, that person really had to believe in the absolute goodness and perfection of the universe, knowing that they were completely looked after, safe, and loved. They had to believe in the nature of the universe. And you know why? Because it was taught that if you opened these Pandora boxes and you could not control your imagination, that you could drive yourself insane because of the things that you would believe. Now, that sounds like a really, really big thing, but I just want you to consider how people with an imagination, they tend to lead towards passion and excitement and how amazing life are. It's intoxicating to be around. But that same imagination can swing to the other side. And the imagination can drive us absolutely insane. And we will just have a very short look into kind of how that looks. So there essentially are a few stages to, let's call it, there's a possession, or there's an obsession, whatever you want to call it. Because I can tell you, it's certainly, as much as I play, it's certainly not funny to the person that's having the actual experience. It's a living hell. Nothing else to it. It's a living hell. The first thing is health. Nearly every case that I'm not just studying cases, I'm studying people that study cases. Nearly every single person, like the guy I'm listening to at the moment, they could not find a single case of where the person had this idea that he was invaded, where they were not all first compromised in health long before. So nearly always there is some sort of nutrient problem. There is a breakdown of the physical vehicle. There are many, many cases of just so documented that usually the person is in a big state of unhealth, which is really, really important to remember, because just like Earth's auric field is emanating from her rivers and her oceans, we all know what happened to the ozone layer, how it started to weaken. Exact same thing is we are emanating this magnetic field around us from our state of health. As the great Mac Khan said, it is not enlightenment unless you can bring it back to the body. Wow, that's a slap in the face. So you can get lost in all your ideas and what, if you can't bring that health back to your body, then it's just ethereal. It's a story that you've built. You as a human being are an interception point for more realities than you can possibly imagine. In other words, there are so many things and dimensions, and you are where they are all housed. So the most sobering truth that you have is the state that this thing that you are housing in is in. So that's the first one that most people don't want to admit when it comes to these issues. It usually starts with very poor health over very long periods, and in something like 95% of cases, terrible nutrition for years. So now whether that means that the demon comes along and goes, oh, it's easier to get in here, or literally what happens is the mechanism starts to break down and our actual whole neurosis starts to fire completely incorrectly. I leave for you to decide. The other thing that is common, almost in the 90-something with all these people, is a few things. I mentioned the shame and the guilt and the fear. They're called the trifactor of psychotic breaks. They're the trifactor of demonology, right? And shame, and it's such an interesting thing because shame is almost like that energy of not wanting to take responsibility for this anymore. This is not actually my fault. I relinquish control. I can't cause damage anymore. Or there's almost like that, it gets so bad that there's almost that will. And what's fascinating is that in most cases, and most people that study this agree that to almost all cases, the person actually purposely relinquishes control, which is an absolutely fascinating, very controversial thing to speak about. But if I can anchor it for us, trauma, there is always a very big traumatic spectrum. Now, I personally in my life have experienced myself fracturing from trauma. It is one of the biggest things, probably the biggest, silliest mistake I made in my life is underestimate trauma. And I have seen what it can do in other people, and I have seen what it can do in my own life. I have got to the points where, in a combination of my PTSD and my epilepsy, and who actually knows what's going on there, I've got to points where psychologically I've become so overwhelmed and so scared that I can't stop, almost like going into a light convulsion and mumbling, and I'm kind of aware what's going on, but I lose parts of my faculty. So the only reason I'm telling you that is just to plug you into, you cannot believe what inner psychic pressures or wounds can do. It's a fascinating thing. And of course, the other thing that's always present whenever there is some sort of possession or some sort of a psychotic break that takes place is, of course, the person is in a very low state of mental health. They very, very seldom have very strong systems of beliefs. They either are the type of person that refuses to really look into the great questions of life, or they're the type of person that are completely scattered in all things. In other words, just like really have never drawn a conclusion about anything. They'll literally believe anything. And interestingly enough, it doesn't matter for us to label them, there are definitely a few religions that are far more prone to accepting that something has happened and a person has completely been taken over. What a fascinating subject. Earth definitely has poles, right? We spoke about the earth body and our body, and we spoke about that. And it's a fascinating thing. There's this idea essentially, and then that's the physical body. The other thing that most researchers write about is that essentially these people go on such a long journey of negation. And if I can put that in another word, they become so negative that they eventually allow a certain aspect of their personality to overthrow them. Some people would argue that they create such a vacuum that something else overthrows them. I once again think it's irrelevant, but you can usually see that it's coming. And like I said, it's not a very controversial thing. There's a very famous saying, and I'm not exactly sure where it comes from. I should Google it, but in spirituality, amongst the Hermetics, the saying was that nature abhors a vacuum. In other words, if you create a vacuum where there's just empty space, something will fill it. And they used to use the saying regarding controlling consciousness or the controlling government of your mind. If you do not want to own that space, if you do not want to possess that space, if you do not want to hold that space, nature abhors a vacuum. Something will. I heard one speaker, I listened to one speaker write in the hundreds of years ago about the fact that if you did not want to house yourself, take charge of yourself, if you did not want responsibility for yourself, that you could be possessed by the very spirit of a cricket. I assume he was being sarcastic, but the whole idea was like, it really doesn't take much if you are not willing to house that. And that's a really big subject about personal responsibility. The other fascinating thing is once the psychotic break or this entity takes over, there are some very, very interesting things wow, it's quite something to be around. They always defend the reality. Very, very often, they will defend the reality above their own lives. It is more important for them, in nearly all cases, to prove to you that what they are experiencing is the truth, opposed to actually getting help. You see this not just with the people I've worked with, not just in the people I've studied. This is a really big, important part. There is an incredible arrogance involved that they are so desperate. They are so desperate. But the only thing you're not allowed to do is suggest that it's not what they think that's going on. This is exactly the same if you look into psychology, if you go into mental institutions. The most complicated thing about this thing is that you create a really big sense of untrust if you disagree with what they're saying is going on. So they have a reality and you have a reality. And if you tell them that their reality is incorrect, then what happens is you lose favor and they begin to distrust you. But here's the paradoxical joke of why this is so hard to treat. If you agree with them that what they say is going on, soon you will be next to them in the same mental institution. So it's almost like one of those damned if you do, damned if you don't things. And it's a very, very fascinating thing. But what is always present in someone that is having a psychotic break and someone that is possessed by an entity is the presence of a particular idea. And the idea is usually something that is so terrifying that they can't look directly at it. So I'm going to slow us down here for a second to try and speak a little bit of maybe this seems impersonal, like maybe you're unsure what I'm saying. So I want to show you what an idea or a belief has to do with how far you fracture. I'm sure that some of you have had an anxiety attack before, okay? And if you're having an anxiety attack, usually you just feel anxious. Now, for most people, the difference between an anxiety attack and a panic attack is actually something happening in the body or a thought happening in the mind. Let me give you an example. You're very, very anxious. You're very, very anxious. And you've just been around someone that you think had COVID. And now you're battling to breathe because anxiety attacks make you battle to breathe. And usually you would just have your anxiety attack and it would pass. But now you have the presence of a terrifying thought in your space. And into your bubble comes the idea you can't breathe because you die. And suddenly it goes from an anxiety attack up into the level of a panic attack. Okay, so can you identify how a really difficult event can blow up into greater proportions? For a panic attack to become a psychotic break, there usually needs to be the presence of a thought or a belief that is almost otherworldly, like something that's so scary that they cannot even wrap their heads around it. Something like, I will be trapped in some hell forever, or something like, something is stealing my soul. And you often see that panic attacks become psychotic breaks when in the presence of religious, spiritual, all sorts of things. Anytime you're dabbling in something where you don't really know what the ramifications are. So the one side of this argument would say, yes, you were doing something and you opened yourself up to it and you had the psychotic break. But essentially, what we see very, very clearly in my understanding of the psychology of it is I'm having a panic attack. It's really, really scary. And the panic attack subsides. What crossed my mind was, I think I'm dying, and the panic attack subsides. But what happens to have happened is I went to a spiritual ceremony, which I'm not used to, a week ago, or I was around someone who pulled out some spiritual game I've never seen, or I've done some ceremony, or I've just read a book and I've tried an exercise. But the idea is that there is something otherworldly you've tapped into. Now, anyone who's ever been in a state of panic will be able to tell you that what happens in a state of panic, especially when it is extended for a long period of time, is that your mind begins to desperately search and grasp for possibilities and answers. And one of the reasons the mind always reaches straight for this idea of the fact that you're dying when it comes to panic attacks is because the experience is so enormous that you cannot imagine it could be anything less. So in other words, your imagination reaches for the worst possibility it can think of. This is where most people's consciousness bottoms out when it comes to freakouts. But enter spirituality, enter ungrounded spirituality, enter ungrounded spirituality without an understanding of the safety and beauty of the universe, enter spirituality lazy, enter spirituality without discipline and with just little broken versions of a story. And now what happens when you move into a state of terror, whether it is because of a lack of nutrients, not looking after your body, weakening of your auric sheath through a lot of drugs, through alcohol, through abuse, through 3 bad marriages, really doesn't matter. When that moment of extreme discomfort that we've all been in happens, and the mind is desperately grasping for something, what is going on? I think I'm dying. You move to the next level. And this is where the zone of supposed entities exists, but also the zone of psychotic breaks. It occurs to that person in that moment that something is attacking them. And in them thinking that, they move this whole thing from 3rd gear into 4th gear. Now, of course, the thought that would come across one's mind is one would think, well, how do we know? I'm going to go as far as to say that it does not matter because the solutions are the same. And I'm not even going to go too far into a lot of the stuff I've just touched on because it would take us hours. I am going to do it when I split this into videos. But I want you to consider, for instance, even the old occult teachers of Pythagoras, we know them as the mathematicians, but they were occultists. Even if you look at Pythagoras and those guys, they spoke about this thing called the magic mirror. And essentially, it's just an explanation of what we know today in psychology, being in a state of psychosis, you literally can create your own delusions. In other words, in a state of psychosis, they see certain things, they hear certain things, they have a full-on experience, things breathing in their ear, whatever the belief would be, right? Which could be considered demonic. But what's absolutely fascinating to observe about people in a psychotic break, if you've ever been really scared, you're in a high state of suggestibility. And someone suggests something and you don't have anything in the foundation of your belief and your love to suggest that it's not true, it permeates you and your psychosis or your delusion grows. And what's fascinating about this whole subject is to realize that we know for fact today that what you're seeing is not necessarily there. An example is it has been proven in psychology that you can insert a fear or an idea into a person's psychotic break and they will begin to actually see that thing. Okay? It's important to be aware of that. So I'm not saying that all the spiritual things you see are delusions. I just need us to acknowledge that as a human being, as a creator, we are infinitely powerful. And if you can, I mean, they've done it. They suggest something and that person, not realizing it was suggested to them, starts seeing that actual thing. You can have complete experiences based on, and watch what they call it, the magic mirror. Because inside that bubble, once fear begins to run rampant, you can psychosomatically create those things. I mean, we know this to be true deeply today. I mean, do you know that asthma is considered psychosomatic? It's very real. I experience it. I have asthma. I can't breathe. But most of that is born of, it's a psychosomatic process. So I'm not going to speak any further into what is actually going on there. I just want to start to kind of pull out to what we can do about this. The first thing that we need to realize is the first line of defense to this whole thing is the person that interferes or insets himself into the situation. And this is where you as a space holder or you as a person need to understand that how deeply you have met your own doubts, how deeply you have met your own fears completely changes the scenario, because a person can tell when you are terrified of the fact of what is going on with them. They can tell how calm you are. They can feel it. And it's a really, really important thing to consider. If you are still very, very nervous of the possibilities and you still hold in your subconscious that some terrible thing is going to hijack a piece of your soul, then unfortunately, whether we admit it or not, as a space holder, if you are taking people to that depths of their psyche, you will reflect it on other people. This has been acknowledged, studied, and seen all around the world in the fact that, for instance, there's a big experiment that the Halva House did, where they discovered that facilitators that spoke a lot about protection and things like that tended to have far more incidences where people think they had had some evil experience or thing they had to engage with. Whereas people that had reframed it in a very different way had an experience of some part of their own darkness that they had to wrestle with or face. So once again, when we talk about creating a container, how we frame and how we ourselves are interacting with that issue and that darkness in its own is very much will be imprinted on that person's psyche. The first step in trying to help one of these people is so difficult, because number one thing you have to do is get the physical vehicle firing at optimum. And when you're having an experience of some form of psychotic break, it is almost impossible to believe that something that simple could be feeding into it. And therefore, when trying to deal with one of these people, you meet the absolute resistance. The best thing they could do against their demon is go for a run and eat an apple every day. And yet, we refuse to accept that that's a possibility. And this is an absolute thing now that psychology and demonology kind of agrees on, is that the person has to repossess their house. And the way that is done is by bringing goodness and wholesomeness and integrity and all of those virtues back into the house. And that begins with the way that you treat the body. The second thing is to get the imagination under control. And that doesn't mean that the imagination is making up things. It might be reaching for vibrational potential or things that exist in some form in the universe. I'm not saying it's made up, but it certainly can access it. Anybody who's ever lain on their back and imagined really scary things and watched how their whole physical experience starts to change knows that we can dial up a radio station. And surely we must understand, if we spend too much time dialing up these stations, that we might sometimes find ourselves in a very precarious situation where we are unable to leave the station for a period. But that really is the greatest danger. And the only way for us to stay on a station and not leave it is if we have built a story of beliefs, thoughts that bound us to that frequency. And therefore, the greatest thing that you can do as a space holder or a healer is to try and attempt to penetrate the story. I don't think people realize how much damage they do when they speak about entities and darkness. And there is absolutely no value in the whole world in telling someone to be careful of those things. There's no value. The same way people break out of these things, it's always the same. I have been part of it hundreds of times. You have to get the person to believe that they are stronger than that thing, number one. Which, if you think about the shit that we are saying to each other, even in spiritual spaces, a person will not admit if they think something is overtaking them. A person will not admit if their government has been overthrown. And it doesn't inspire confidence. And I can tell you now that any government can be reinstated, whether it is a demon or a psychotic break. And whether it is a demon or a psychotic break, I can tell you now the path is one of creating an extremely safe space by where a person can revisit and feel their traumas, an extremely safe space free of superstition and unresolved stuff from the space holder, where they can explore their beliefs regarding it. And then there is another level, and I'm not going to go through all of them now. And that level essentially is the one of getting the person, this is when they get deeper into their healing, to admit that they are contracted with that entity. So whether it is that they had a psychotic break and they no longer wanted to be the responsible person driving the house, and they pulled aside from shame or to blame it on another aspect of themselves, or this part of their personality didn't have the strength or anger that was required to get through the trauma. So they stepped aside and they allowed someone in the government to take over. And unfortunately, you know what happens with power once it switches, or if it's a demon, it does not matter. The point is, one has to admit that you are actually getting something from not being in power. It is different for everyone else. For everyone, but I can give you an example. The alcoholic has to admit that even though he can blame the fact that he's possessed by the alcoholic spirit or the entity that is attached to him and feeding off him, if that's what he wants to believe, he has to admit that the only way an entity can exhibit or live with a person is if they are both a vibrational match. In other words, I get drunk and I get to feel the lack of responsibility, which is what I crave, and you get to take the energy, which is what you crave. It's the perfect union. All states of demonology, in my perspective, are always the perfect union. You might be a drama addict, absolutely immersed in drama, and there might be an entity involved. I don't even use the word entity. To me, it is just a pocket of consciousness. You are a being of polarity. It's a form of negation. It's a way of charging air and space. To me, it's so irrelevant whether, I don't find it that hard to believe that if I had certain feelings for long enough, that those feelings could be slightly conscious in their own. I don't find that hard to believe. But I think the most important thing to realize when you're dealing or when you're trying to heal these people is that once they've realized they're stronger than this thing, once they've realized how they've given that power over, they then need to admit what it is they're getting from that thing. Well, I get to be dramatic and I get to whatever it is. And it's incredible how, regardless of whether you're dealing with a being or with the schism of the personality, what's always required is that safety, that love, and that possibility. And it's a difficult one because to admit that you are in a contract with an entity, which I'm just going to call a part of my psyche because that's more the way I perceive it. To admit that I'm getting something from that is a very hard step because what that does is it immediately removes the victimization of the side. In closing, as we bring it home, I think that the most important thing for us to realize is that what is common in all of these things is fear and the relationship towards fear. The worse the situation gets for the psychotic, there is usually in the back of a psychotic's mind something that is so terrifying that he can't for a second consider the possibility. If it was tangible, he wouldn't be a psychotic. If someone is having a psychotic break about the fact that the wall is not there and you can show them the wall is there, that's different. Or same thing with the supposed entity. It is usually something unprovable, an idea so terrifying that that person needs to find some form of safety, which will get them to be able to look at it. And it's a really, really big thing to learn how to lead someone safely to what it is they think that is going to happen. And for most people, it's things like something stealing my soul, or it's things like I'm not whole anymore, something's in charge of me. And when they begin to actually be able to verbalize it in a safe space, they often become, soberly integrated. But I think the most important thing is that your thoughts and feelings of what you really think is going on there are actually not important. I can tell you now that if you walked into the space and you were not afraid of anything that's going on there, and you can see how fear is the main driver, you will know what to say and what not to say. And essentially, it is basically facilitating a process from A to Z of a person getting to the point where they are so empowered that they repossess their house. That's the bottom line. Whatever it is you believe is irrelevant. I know that it can be done. I've seen it done, and anybody can do it in their own case. Archetypally, we all have a part of our nature that is pushing a little bit for control. It's a constant natural process of being a human being. And we keep reestablishing dominance through the government. And in some cases, the traumas and the health and the state of the energy field are just so out of whack that essentially the poles flip. Isn't it incredible that it even happens to Earth? that if the magnetic rings of the earth get too weak in some ways, the actual poles flip, almost like a reorganization in the magnetic governance of earth. It's a fascinating conversation, and it also makes you really look differently at what it is. A lot of people think they're bringing value as a facilitator when speaking power into fear, and they're not. What most people deal with this issue, most spiritual healers I know, they deal with this issue by feeding into the fear and then creating some other thing that will make that person feel strong for a while around that fear, like how we dealt with it for thousands of years through talisman, or through something you must keep with you, or the fact that just because that healer's around, you're going to be okay for a while. These are temporary solutions. This is just feeding into a problem that honestly is just going to become a black hole of negation. The only route to retribution regarding this is leading a person to how powerful they are, and that there's absolutely nothing in the universe that can override your absolute free conscious will to inhabit the being that you currently sit in. And hopefully I've really just flitted across a lot of subjects, but there is a possibility to be alive within what Dante would call your paradiso, your temporary heaven here on earth. So yeah, it's a really, really big subject.